A number of you have asked me to speak about bonsai soils. So this talk is going to be about the best substrate or soil for growing your bonsai in. This talk is really about very down-to-earth matters. The very word earth signifies the soil on which we stand and the plants which grow from the soil. There's no real magic about soil because soil is so basic that we take it for granted. But if we analyze the soil, we will soon realize that there are different types of soil and different plants grow better in one type of soil or they grow better in other types of soil. Now, if you ask 100 bonsai growers what soil they use, they will all have their own particular favorite recipe for soils. So to say that there is a be-all and end-all, a magic formula for soil would be very misleading. There is no such thing as a magic formula because soils depend on the environment in which you live, the climate in which you live. For instance, soils that we use in the tropics will be different from the soils that we use in the temperate regions, and so on. I will tell you basically about the soils that we use in the temperate climates and some of the soils that Japanese growers use, because Japanese trees and also Chinese trees are now exported all over the world, and I will comment about the soils which the plants come in, but which you may need to adapt to grow bonsai successfully. To be absolutely frank, you can grow plants in any type of soil. You can dig the mud from the garden, ordinary garden mud, put it in a pot and put a plant in it and it will grow. It is as simple as that. To say that plants will not grow in mud soil would be to tell a lie. But yet you will find that different expert growers, specialist nurseries, they have come across the compost or the substrate, to use a technical term, which are ideal, which are optimum substrates for the plants that they grow. I brought here one of the nursery plants that we buy from some of our wholesale nursery suppliers. This is a Hinoki cypress, and I will be demonstrating on this in another YouTube video. But if we take the plant out of this pot, look at the beautiful roots that are growing in this pot. And if you look at the soil carefully, the soil that they've used is nothing but a peat compost with a bit of bark. Nothing more to it than that. So this tree is probably only a 2-year-old cutting, but it's growing so vigorously, and this is the soil they use. Now you might ask, why can't I grow bonsai in this type of soil? Of course you can grow bonsai in this soil. There's nothing to stop you growing bonsai in this soil. In fact, it might grow quite well. A lot of the Chinese indoor bonsai come in a soil which is just like this, either cocoa, bark and peat, or just sphagnum moss peat, and the trees will grow very well. The trouble with using just that is that it doesn't have body and it may not be able to support large trees. It won't be able to hold the roots to make the tree stand up. Especially if you use a shallow bonsai pot, the tree will not be able to stand upright. So for that reason, we use a mixture of soils. Now, most soils that plants grow in consist of 3 basic elements. You have sand or grit, and then clay, and then you may have like a loam, which is a very sandy type of clay. But basically it's a mixture of those ingredients. But when it comes to mixing bonsai compost, if I just take you around and show you some of the compost that we use. If you look carefully here, we're in the middle of our repotting season. This is yew that we've just potted up, and this is the standard compost that we use. Look at it. It's not just peat, although, as I said, you could grow it in pure peat. There's no reason why you can't. But this standard soil of ours, our heron soil, has about 5 and sometimes 6 ingredients. So we have akadama, 1/3 of that, and then we have a type of pumice or volcanic grit, and then we have sphagnum moss peat and orchid bark. So those are the main ingredients. You can add other types of pumice or crushed brick in it as well, and that will facilitate drainage. So for bonsai, we have a very open texture in the soil, very open texture. But we don't use just 100% akadama or 100% peat and bark, or even 100% crushed brick. You could grow it in that, but this is the optimum mix that we use. We can put some fertilizer in it, but we prefer not to add fertilizer to the soil, but we simply put the soil as it is, and then we add the fertilizer as the trees begin to grow. So this is our basic mix. If we now look at the individual ingredients closely, this is the Japanese akadama. This is the standard size that we use, which is from about 3 millimeter to about 7 or 8 millimeter. Akadama comes in different grades. You can get very large particle akadama, or this is the fine grade akadama, and then you can get the shohin grade akadama, which is almost like sand. Now, in case you don't know what akadama is a Japanese soil. Akadama simply means red clay. Aka is red and dama is the clay. So akadama is simply red clay. It is produced artificially in Japan, I believe somewhere in Saitama, and they mine this clay from deep underground. So it's almost inert, and it is fairly sterile, I was told. So they dig this clay from deep underground, and then they mix it with water into sheets, and then they roll the sheets out, let it dry in the sun, and then the sheets of clay are crushed, and the crushed clay is sieved into different particle sizes. So you have a range of different particles for akadama. Now in Japan, akadama is used almost neat. They plant a lot of things in just akadama, nothing else, and the trees grow very, very well. But I have found over the years, and we've been importing trees from Japan since the early 80s, we find that if you bring akadama into the temperate regions like UK and Europe, the akadama dries very quickly. In Japan, akadama works well. Akadama used neat works well because they have a very wet, rainy season. It's almost like a monsoon season. And in that sort of very heavy rainy season, the akadama drains extremely well. So you don't have to worry about using akadama neat in Japan. But we find that if you use it neat in the temperate regions, like in the UK and Europe, it dries out too quickly. And in the summer, because we don't have so much rain, it dries very quickly. So it is not ideal. Among the other soils we've got, before I talk about the mix, this is a Japanese volcanic grit that we import, and it is literally a volcanic grit, and this is just used for drainage. And because it's volcanic, I would say that the pH value must be slightly acidic. Then this very interesting material, in different countries you get different colors to this. This is a fired brick. It's a brick clay which is fired to a very high temperature. It's fired to about 1100 or 1200 degrees, almost stoneware temperatures. And when the clay is fired to that temperature, it becomes like ceramic particles, and it never breaks down. So extremely good for drainage. So this is very good. In places like India, you can use ordinary red crushed brick if you don't have anything else. But if you can get clinker, which is the very high fired brick, usually when the temperature goes very high, it fuses and it doesn't become very useful for anything else. So that can be crushed So the crushed clinker is also very good as a potting medium. Some of these other materials that are brought here. This is called hyuga. This is another Japanese soil which is like a very light Japanese pumice. It almost weighs nothing. It is so light. It absolutely is light. It doesn't weigh down on plants. So this is sometimes used as a drainage layer, or if you pot a large plant, you can mix it with the bonsai compost. And this last material I want to show you here, this is the famous Kanuma soil. The Japanese have found that growing azaleas in this Kanuma soil, which is acidic, very, very light, and they mix 30% or 1/3 sphagnum moss to this, and that is the ideal potting medium for Satsuki azaleas. It is so light and the azalea roots are so fine that the roots can penetrate the soil very easily. I will just show you what sphagnum moss looks like. And the sphagnum moss is this. We buy this from wholesale suppliers who import this all the way from New Zealand. And this is a sphagnum moss that is used for mixing with the Kanuma soil. So you mix 1/3 sphagnum moss with the Kanuma soil, and that is the ideal potting medium for Satsuki azaleas. This is our standard compost which we use for potting up our seedlings, and this is 50-50 of pine, crushed pine bark and sphagnum moss peat. We don't use cocoa fiber, but we can still use moss peat, so we use that in our mix. So the mix that we sell for bonsai, in fact the outdoor bonsai, we use equal parts of this material, the crushed brick, akadama, and then we probably add some pumice as well. So the mixture I showed you earlier on is the standard Heron's bonsai mix. A number of you may have come across articles that I wrote 20 or 30 years ago, and people in the bonsai world call it the Peter Chan's moss trick. I have found over the years that plants which are sick, when they are potted into sphagnum moss, if you have a sick tree and you plant it in sphagnum moss, the tree will revive very, very quickly. So sometimes when a tree is not doing well, this is what we do. This juniper wasn't doing well about 2 years ago, so we put it in a large tray that has a lot of holes for aerating it, and this was just planted in pure sphagnum moss. You can see the moss that we've used, and look at the roots that have come out from underneath, absolutely crammed with roots. And a tree that had hardly any root, by planting it in pure moss, this is what we get. I can't even get it out of the tray. It is so tight. Just about, look at it. Look at the roots in here. And this is the sphagnum moss in which it is growing. So sphagnum moss is a very good medium for putting sick trees in, because it revives the tree no end. And what made me think of using sphagnum moss was from my air layering experiments. I found that because sphagnum moss sends or encourages the branches to send out roots, I thought that if you put a sick plant in sphagnum moss, it will generate roots. So true enough, if you do that, you will find that any sick plant put in sphagnum moss, but you need to keep it well watered, and in a closed environment, it will revive very quickly and send out roots. This is another example. This is a rigida that I'm about to work on. It's a bit sick, so I put it in this time. I did put it in sphagnum moss, you can see there. You can see the sphagnum moss, but I've topped it with a bit of peat. But this is what it's been growing in sphagnum moss, and see the growth you get from putting sick plants in pure sphagnum moss. So that is all I need to say about the soils. So don't be afraid to experiment, because in different countries you need to adapt the soil to the growing conditions. If you have very wet and rainy conditions like in the tropics, you may need to use more drainage material. And then in countries like Western Europe, we use a mix that I just talked about, where we use equal parts of akadama, crushed brick, sphagnum moss peat, and pine bark. But just experiment and you'll find that trees will grow in virtually anything. The indoor trees, because they grow in a closed environment in the house, we find that using a more peaty-based compost helps to retain the moisture better, whereas these composts that have large particles of grit and clay, they are more suited to the outdoor trees. And then remember to add the fertilizer or the nutrients after you've potted the tree up. So don't need to mix nutrient or fertilizer in the bonsai soil that you use. So I hope that has been helpful, and it may not tell you or give you a secret recipe, but basically it's a mixture of different materials to encourage drainage. So drainage is the key to growing bonsai successfully, because the roots need to breathe air. Don't forget, you look at these trays, these are trays that have a lot of aeration. You see, they're just baskets in fact. So the more air you give the roots, the better they perform. So roots not only take up moisture and nutrients, but they also need air to breathe. So that's very important to remember. So there you are. Have a go and your bonsai will grow successfully.